Okay. Okay. So thanks again for joining. I'm SJ. I'm Communications Manager with Commission Shift. And at Commission Shift, we believe the State Oil and Gas Agency, the Railroad Commission, can better protect our natural resources and our well-being. We educate, advocate, and build public support for reforms that protect our public health, our land, and our water. So today we're debriefing on the Railroad Commission open meeting that happened this morning. And this is in an effort to bring more awareness and transparency to the Oil and Gas Agency's proceedings. I am joined by Commission Shift's Executive Director, Virginia Palacios, who's going to cover some of the highlights and go a little more in depth about what these agenda items mean for the rest of us. So thanks again for joining. I'm going to quickly announce some things on our calendar that we're looking forward to, ways for folks to get involved with the work that we do. We have a Community Connect space on August 29th at 6 p.m. This is a virtual space for people who want to work with us to build reform at the Railroad Commission and see actual tangible changes. And that space also has an office hours a couple days before on August 27th. Again, to talk to staff about issues and ideas that you have. We also have a CCUS deep dive series where you can get a lot of in-depth information about carbon capture and injection wells. And the next webinar for that deep dive is tentatively for September 10th. So stay tuned for information on joining that space as well to learn more. So with that, Virginia, I'm going to let you take it away and talk to us a little bit about what you saw in person there at the open meeting in Austin.
Sure. So, yeah, I gave public input. I thanked the Railroad Commission. They took a lot of our suggestions on the monitoring and enforcement plan, and this was really unexpected because the past 3 years they kind of barely took any suggestions. They would make a few formatting changes that we had suggested on that plan. But this year, they sought public comment before drafting the plan. And then they ended up taking the majority of our recommendations and putting it straight into the plan. So we were really pleased to see that, and we thanked them for it. And then we kind of brought up the waste pit rulemaking, which we'll talk more about later. And one of our big concerns there is around what we saw in the informal draft that came out in October was a pilot study provision that would allow treated drill cuttings to be used as road-based or construction-based material. And we have a lot of concerns about potential pollution with that kind of a thing. And then lastly, we asked for an update on all the studies that the Railroad Commission is doing on the geology and issues that seem to be happening as a result of underground injection in West Texas and all the leaks and unplugged wells. And so they had no response to that. We didn't hear anything from them on the injection wells or the investigation that's taking place with the Groundwater Protection Council. But maybe in the future we will. The Groundwater Protection Council is I don't know if like consortium is the right thing. It's a bunch of state oil and gas agencies that come together and compare notes on groundwater protection. And so they're working with that group of different state agencies to investigate their underground injection control program. This appears to be in relation to a letter that Commission Shift sent to the EPA asking the EPA to consider revoking the Railroad Commission's underground injection primacy for Class 2 disposal wells. So these are wells where the commission disposes of salt water that's produced from oil and gas, or where they allow oil and gas operators to inject water or carbon dioxide to produce more oil out of a spent oil well. But I'm getting way too into the weeds on that, so I'm going to move on. We had a lot of interesting public input come through the Railroad Commission open meeting today. The first was a letter from Luke Shipp, and there were 3 folks that came up to read different parts of that letter. And so Luke Shipp is a retired oil and gas industry professional, has done a lot of well cementing, casing, plugging, all kinds of stuff. And his neighbor experienced a groundwater contamination incident about 1.5 miles away related to a Class 2 disposal well. And Luke is also very concerned that this is going to affect his water quality also because it's so close. One of the reasons why he wrote this letter to the commission was because at the last open meeting, Commissioner Christian told me that there had never been a groundwater contamination incident in Texas related to a class 2 disposal well. And so Luke wanted to make sure that it was on the record that there has been a contamination incident, that this has been confirmed, at least one, probably more. And so one thing that Luke pointed out in his letter is that these disposal wells are required to have what's called an H5 or mechanical integrity test every 5 years. And that well did not have any documentation for its required 5-year mechanical integrity test. Luke also pointed out he thinks that that test should take place at least every year. And so the broader significance, right, is what is going to happen as this new technology of carbon capture and storage is unleashed in Texas. And so there are these federal tax credits right now that are making it much more lucrative for oil and gas operators to either inject carbon dioxide underground for enhanced oil recovery into a class 2 well, or potentially in the future, injecting carbon dioxide underground for long-term storage into a class 6 well. And so class 6 wells are just a different type of injection well, and the Railroad Commission is trying to get authority from the EPA to be the sole permitting and regulatory authority over those types of wells. We disagree with that at Commission Shift because of all the problems we're seeing with class 2 injection wells. And so this letter from Luke is just kind of underscoring the concerns that we have with earthquakes, all the leaks we're seeing in unplugged wells, the sinkholes we're seeing in West Texas and East Texas that are related to injection wells, and the concern that we have that those types of problems won't be confined to class 2 wells, but will also occur when you start doing class 6 injection. And so, let's see. Moving on, there was another person who is named Laura Briggs and couldn't be at the meeting today. She asked Sarah Stogner to read her letter. Sarah Stogner asked for permission from the Railroad Commission to read someone else's letter, and they told her no. So she was unable to read Laura's letter. But recently, Laura had a well on her property. I don't want to say start, but worsen in leaking and blowing out. And so Laura had first reported this well leak to the commission over a year ago. And the Railroad Commission inspectors, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't know what was said word for word, essentially told her, like, all the wells are leaking, like, we'll come back when it's bad enough. And so I guess now it's bad enough. And so the sad part is that, you know, when there was a lesser problem that would have been less expensive to fix and had not caused as much damage, the Railroad Commission did not go to fix it. And now there's a much bigger problem on her property and a much larger mess to clean up and potentially worse groundwater contamination. And so this is the kind of thing where it's just a clear example of the current Railroad Commission policies not working. We do need the legislature to authorize, you know, more funding to go to the Railroad Commission so that they can plug these orphaned wells and make operators plug their own inactive wells in a more timely manner. We can't keep letting these wells sit around because there's not enough money. You know, we need to make sure that we're collecting that money, and there are real big obvious flaws in state law that are resulting in us not having enough money to plug these wells in a timely manner. Next, Sarah Stogner did present her own information. And so there was a study that came out from Southern Methodist University a couple weeks ago. Some researchers, let's see, Vamshi Garanam, Zhang Lu, and Jin Woo Kim. My apologies if I mispronounced any of those names. And this study is called Investigation of Oil Well Blowouts Triggered by Wastewater Injection in the Permian Basin, USA. And that's published in Geophysical Research Letters, a peer-reviewed journal. And so that journal article showed that the Crane County geyser-like well blowout that happened in January 2022 was in fact linked to underground injection into class 2 disposal wells. And so they documented using satellite imagery uplift of surface the surface, the land occurring from that, and in some cases sinkholes, and they linked that particular blowout to underground injection. And so this is significant. It's great to see people actually putting the science together on this stuff. And now we need to see the commission reacting to it and changing their policies around underground injection. And also we need to see the EPA taking heed and considering, is this agency, the Railroad Commission, capable of handling new types of underground injection as carbon capture and storage is potentially unleashed in Texas? And, we are already seeing the EPA start to permit these class 6 wells in Texas. If they grant Railroad Commission primacy, then they will transfer those wells to the Railroad Commission's authority and oversight. So there are real concerns there over what could happen with this new type of chemical underground.
And on the theme of groundwater contamination, Virginia, I mean, considering the class 2 contamination case from Luke Ship and threats to groundwater with new technology that you're talking about here, can you speak to the Railroad Commission's track record for testing groundwater for contamination? Is that part of their practice, or how do they, how can they stand on this sort of, we have a flawless record?
Right. Well,
What-
thanks for asking that, because one thing we've learned from a lot of the folks that have talked to us about their leaking wells on their property is that the Railroad Commission is not testing for groundwater contamination every time an unplugged well is leaking or every time there's a blowout. And so, you know, maybe Commissioner Christian believes that there haven't been any groundwater contamination incidents because people aren't actually testing for groundwater contamination, but that doesn't mean that groundwater has not been contaminated. And so that's an important flaw in the procedures of the Railroad Commission, is that that kind of monitoring and testing doesn't seem to be taking place on a consistent basis.
And then I think it's also worth noting with this study that this SMU study that we linked in the chat, I'll link it again, linking the blowout wells with injection wells causing like blowouts in other cases. When Sarah Stogner presented this study to the commissioners today at the open meeting, it was another kind of huge point of tension, or yeah, I'll call it that, in the meeting space. Can you talk a little bit about being in the room when Sarah had this printout?
So she had the study, she had copies of the study that she wanted to give the commissioners, and she just walked right up to the dais to give it to them. And Commissioner Craddock told her several times not to approach the dais and to instead give it to the secretary in the back of the room. We saw this happen back in March when Commission Shift was at the Railroad Commission too. We wanted to give carnations to the commissioners. We had bouquets of flowers to give to them, and they freaked out when we approached the bench. There just seems to be a lot of like testiness with the commissioners. It's an odd reaction from them to have so much fear from members of the public who are simply giving them information or giving them flowers, quite literally.
Yeah, it definitely brings up the question of like, who is allowed to approach the railroad commissioners and how? Because there's a lot of actual kind of control in this environment, like the letter that wasn't allowed to be read, the paper that's not allowed to touch the podium, the flowers. Like, you're right, there is a pattern, right?
Yeah, and I think Commissioner Craddock told Sarah, like, the procedure is to give it to the secretary in the back of the room. Like, okay. But the pattern that you're talking about also, it plays out in different ways. I mean, when these guys are like blowouts occurred in Crane County, there were two, right? There was one in January 2022 and one in December 2023. Both cost around $2.5 million to get under control. When those were occurring, Sarah and maybe Ashley Watt, they were trying to use drones to take some footage of what was going on. And the Railroad Commission went to the FAA and got no-fly zone restrictions on the areas for safety reasons. Well, if people are working on site in an area like that, it's a very short radius in which a drone might fall out of the sky and fall onto someone. And so I think the flight restrictions that they got were like a pretty large radius. I forget if it was a mile or 5 miles, but even then, you don't really need that much of a restriction when it comes to a drone kind of going around and just trying to document what was going on. But it felt like, and it appeared to be, a real restriction on public information and public access to information. And so those are the kinds of things where we really need to question like how people's First Amendment rights are being infringed upon by this agency that doesn't want people to see what it did wrong.
All right, I think we should definitely talk about waste pits a bit more. Is there, I guess, yeah, maybe we can kind of give an overview for folks like, waste pits was on the agenda today, chapter 8, amendments to chapter 8 rule. Can you speak a little bit about sort of the process that's led us to this point and why we're concerned about waste pits, like from the perspective of if you live close to them, and also from the perspective of, if you're just a Texan, what is the concern?
Okay, so waste pits are facilities at the surface that are used to dispose of oil and gas waste sludge. So things like drill cuttings, potentially other chemicals that are used in the drilling, extraction, and production processes that kind of end up in mud or other sludgy, solid type products. And so sometimes they're disposed of and stored in these big pits at the surface. And so you see a lot of this material kind of just piled up at the pit, and that is where it will remain forever. But more frequently now, the industry is trying to recycle those materials. And so they will treat the materials and try to get any valuable products out of them and then dispose of whatever they can't get valuable product out of. And so this rulemaking has to do with water protection. And so the rule that has existed on the books for a long time was called Statewide Rule 8. And that now is going to move into a new chapter in the Railroad Commission. It's called Chapter 4, and I think it's Subchapter A. And so that'll be like new information over there with some alterations. And then there's going to be a whole new or a lot of amendments in this other subchapter called Subchapter B that is within Chapter 4. And so that subchapter has more information specific to the recycling facilities. But there's also a whole section of that subchapter that is related to potential pilot projects. As I mentioned before, one of the big concerns we had is like using this type of waste in county roads as road base or on oil and gas lease roads as road base, or just as construction fill, which could be anywhere. And so that was one of our big concerns. But we started working on this issue because we started hearing from neighbors of these facilities all throughout the state. I mean, really in every part of Texas who had had problems with the waste pits. Some people were living next to these waste pits and experiencing really bad fumes and air emissions from the waste pits. One family told us they woke up in the middle of the night with nausea and vomiting because it was so bad. They later found out that that particular facility was accepting waste that it was not permitted to accept. So they were illegally accepting kinds of waste that they weren't supposed to be taking. And the Railroad Commission, even though it was receiving quarterly reports from the facility, wasn't checking those reports and wasn't enforcing to make sure that the facility was taking only the things that it was permitted to take. So that was a big problem. That highlighted for us that the Railroad Commission doesn't even have, or had not at the time even had, any enforcement staff in that waste pit division. They now do have, I think, 3 or 4 FTEs or employees working full-time on compliance in that division, but it was just a wake-up call to realize there's all these rules at the commission and no one to enforce them, even though you have 1,000+ person agency pushing papers around all day long. In other parts of the state, we've heard stories from folks living next to these waste pit facilities and ending up with an oily sheen running across their property after a big rain. So runoff can be an issue. We've heard of groundwater contamination from other folks. And the community of Nordheim in particular has really been dealing with an array of issues related to these pits for a long time. They have fought hard and come out in full force to permit hearings and still had very, very little at the end of the day from the Railroad Commission. And so, um, yeah, I think real concerns. And, if nothing else, the one thing that we do want to see come out of this process is better public engagement standards. We want to make sure that people are getting notice about these facilities and with enough time for them to actually respond. Oftentimes, folks only have 15 days to be able to respond to a letter that they may or may not receive in the mail about a facility going in next door. And that's just not enough. We also want to make sure that people who are potentially affected can get acknowledged as and have what's called party status to be able to officially participate and contest a permit application. Sometimes it can be really hard to get party status. Um, we just want better information provided to people. We've heard of some folks having to pay six figures to fight these permit applications, just like regular people. And part of the reason has been because the Railroad Commission has allowed the companies to repeatedly amend their permit applications, and that's not done in other states. In other states, you get maybe one amendment to your permit application and then it's done, and then you can't keep amending it. But at the Railroad Commission, they haven't really been observing limitations like that. And so a company can pretty much keep doing amendments and wear out the community that is contesting the permit application. So, these are some of the concerns that we have. I think, like, more broadly, Texans should be concerned about the way that our aquifers are facing risks and being exposed to new pollution and potential chemicals. We're increasingly experiencing droughts in Texas. We're increasingly facing groundwater shortages. There's more predictions that water import and export are going to be ever more important throughout the state of Texas. Water desalination, these are really expensive technologies. And so we need to make sure that we're protecting all the freshwater resources that we have, because that is the lowest cost resource for water for the state of Texas.
So Virginia, can you share, what we're telling folks to do right now? The new rule was announced. So what can people do about it?
Sure. So the rule should be officially published in the Texas Register at the end of the month. And after that happens, then a 30-day comment period will open. Usually after the Railroad Commission proposes the rule and approves it at their open meeting, they publish it within the day. We've been refreshing the proposed rules page on the Railroad Commission website, and we're not seeing it yet, but probably by tomorrow morning it'll be up and folks will be able to take a look at that. It is a long rule change. The informal draft that we saw back in October was at least 150 pages of rule changes. And so it's not something that a regular person can get through in a 30-day period and be able to write comments on. It's just not. And so we are encouraging folks, if you want to get into it and be able to give good comments, go ahead and write the commission and ask for a 90-day comment period. We're also encouraging folks to write the commission and ask for a public hearing, especially if you live next to one of these waste pits, you have experience with what's gone on. We went through the informal comment period last fall, and we asked the commission to go around the state, meet with people in district who live next to these pits, do public hearings, and they decided not to. They did a public hearing in Austin where a bunch of industry folks were able to attend. There are no waste pits in Travis County. Like, there's no waste pits in Austin. There's no oil and gas development in Austin. And so there was no reason for them to do that other than it being convenient for the commission. They also held a virtual public hearing at 12 p.m. on a Friday. Again, most working people can't steal away from work to go to a virtual hearing in the middle of the day. And so we want to see the commission holding public hearings throughout the state in district at times when working people can attend. Yeah, I think, more broadly, when folks are getting ready to prepare public comments, it's really important to share your own personal story, especially if you've lived next to one of these facilities. Just talk about the things that have impacted you, the things that you would want to see look different at these waste pits. Even if you don't have time to read through the rule in detail, it's important to get your story written down on paper and sent and a part of the official record. Now that we're in the formal rulemaking process, the Railroad Commission has to respond to any questions or comments that come through in the rulemaking. And so this is a really important time to get them on the record responding to the public.
Thanks, Virginia. I think we have time to take questions, so I want to make sure that folks have a chance. You can use the chat or you can come off mute. We're a pretty small group. So definitely be thinking if you have questions. Virginia, is there any other like final thoughts that you have on the waste pit rule, looking ahead or reflecting back on the process?
I guess like one thing that I didn't mention is that the Railroad Commission started this rulemaking process with the industry just over 2 years ago. And so they were meeting with the waste industry companies for the better part of 2 years behind closed doors, not inviting the public to any of those meetings. And so the companies got to see several drafts of that rule before we ever got a hold of it. We found out about this through open records request, and we made sure to engage the public as soon as possible and start asking the commission to engage the public more. They did what I just described, which was pretty lackluster public meetings and webinars. But we do want to see more from the commission. We have talked to them about what meaningful public engagement really looks like, and we have met with them to walk through our comments, which we wrote. We wrote very detailed comments on the informal draft of the rule, and we're hoping to see them actually accepting a lot of our input in this draft, which hopefully we'll see by the end of the day today or early tomorrow.
Thanks. And do we have questions from folks joining our live stream or our webinar today? All right. I can give a couple reminders as well. The next September open meeting for the Railroad Commission is September 24th. So we'll be back covering that with live tweets and another virtual debrief like this one to go over whatever happens in that September meeting. Today was quite a doozy, I have to say. I think maybe because there wasn't a meeting in July, but I felt like it was back, it was like back with a vengeance today. There was hundreds, more than normal, I feel like, agenda items, but anyway, the next one is next month.
All the enforcement actions accrue. They don't stop happening just because we go on summer vacation.
I have a question.
Yes, thanks. Go ahead.
Yes, I heard Virginia talking about the waste people being allowed to put up waste in public roads and stuff like that. Do we have access to documentation stating where that waste is being put in those public roadways?
So right now, this is a proposal that is a part of the rulemaking. And so it's a part of the proposed rule that will allow pilot studies for putting road waste on, or putting that oil and gas waste on roads as road base. However, I forgot to mention this earlier. So when I made my public comment during the open meeting earlier today, Commissioner Wright did say that he thinks that that particular part of the rule that was in the informal draft ended up not getting into the formal draft that was approved today. And so that might not actually be in this rulemaking. We'll find out as soon as they publish it on their website. But it sounds like they may have actually taken our input from that informal comment period and realized that, hey, we don't have enough data to prove that this is safe yet. Let's continue to go do the studies. And so they've been working, I forget which institutions he mentioned they were working with today. I know in the past they've talked to the Transportation Technology Institute and the Texas Department of Transportation about this kind of stuff, but they also tend to work with the UT Bureau of Economic Geology on studying this kind of thing. And so they're going through the process to study this stuff. We'll see where they get, but we certainly want to make sure that we're not ending up with more carcinogenic in materials that could end up into waterways or affecting people's properties.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I read an article that in Texas, some oil companies applied to put their waterways on rivers, creeks, and streams in Texas, right? Did those permits go out already, or are those on standby?
Wow, such a good question to ask. So we were just talking about this earlier today, and I'm looking at Julie Range, who's our policy manager, just right next to me. You want to say hi?
Hello.
So there's two ways that can work. And so, as I mentioned before, produced water is salt water that comes up from an oil and gas well when you produce oil and gas. It's naturally occurring in the oil and gas formations, and it just comes up when you produce oil and gas. It can be like very salty. It can have radioactive materials in it. So you want to make sure that it's like treated before anything like that happens. Typically they dispose of produced water in these class 2 injection wells that I was talking about earlier, but increasingly state legislators and others are looking for other ways to dispose of that produced water. And one way is to discharge it into surface water bodies like creeks and streams. And another way is to just spread it on land. And so one thing we saw in the informal draft of this rule was pilot studies for land spreading. And so that would be like a railroad commission regulated activity, is if it's going on soil. But right now the TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which is a different agency, already has authority to do surface wastewater discharge of produced water. And so it does have to be treated to a certain standard. I don't know exactly what folks are saying about whether they feel that standard is clean enough or not. Part of the controversy has been that sometimes produced water also contains what's called flowback water. Flowback water includes chemicals that companies inject during the fracking or the hydraulic fracturing process downhole. And so some of that stuff comes back up when you start to produce oil and gas. But those chemicals can be essentially designer chemicals. So they're proprietary. We have no information about those chemicals. They're considered to be confidential business information. And so if at the end of the day, you can't test for those chemicals in the water that you're going to be discharging or the water that you're going to be spreading on land, then you have no idea if you've actually truly cleaned the water and prevented those chemicals from ending up in the environment. The big concern, right, is what we're hearing about now about some of these persistent chemicals that never biodegrade, the kind that can accumulate over time and become more toxic over time. So a lot of people have probably heard of PFAS, right? This is one of those chemicals that in very tiny quantities can be highly toxic to human beings and to other forms of life, and never goes away. It's a forever chemical. And so those are the kinds of things that we have to consider when we're thinking about where this kind of waste gets disposed of.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah, those are awesome questions. And I part of me, in the back of my head thinks recycling, it must be good. Like recycling seems like a good thing we should be doing. But when you talk about oil field waste, it's not the recycling that I think a lot of people think of for the reasons that you outlined. Sharon says in the chat, we need full disclosure of all chemicals used before they discharge. Agreed. So I think with that, thank you, Virginia, for hopping on and giving us this update from the open meeting. Thank you, everyone who joined. If you haven't already, please sign up for Commission Shift's newsletter. We keep folks updated there with events on our calendar, with these open meetings. There's lots of resources and information on our website, commissionshift.org. And we are on a lot of social media channels, including Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So follow us there as well. And we'll be back for the September open meeting, and looking forward to staying in touch with everyone as we learn more about the waste pits rule.
Thanks, SJ, and thanks everyone for
Thanks
coming.
for doing this.
Thank you.